Good morning. And well, with 5 minutes later than the schedule, I apologize for that. We begin our second session of this conference. Welcome, welcome today to this conference. We will have the first session here and not in the Salón de Grados as it was scheduled, because we have had some problems with Michal Felling's speech. He had last week some health issues and he had to stay in Germany. So we are going to do that using an internet system. We hope that will work. We have tested it and theoretically it should. But, so I apologize also for this little inconvenience. We will do the first session here. After that, we are going to have the coffee break in exactly the same room that we had yesterday. And after that, we will descend, we will go down to the Salón de Grados, which is nicer and bigger. And we will finish the conference this morning in the Salón de Grados. That's for the organizing issue. Having said that, I am very glad to introduce you, even though I think it's not necessary, Professor Michal. As you know, she is an expert in competition law. She is the director, main coordinator of this international network of competition law studies. She's professor not only at the University of Haifa, but also visiting scholar in some other universities, for instance, Columbia. So it's really easy to introduce her because I think that everyone here knows her. And she accepted the proposal that we made to her. We are extremely grateful for that. And she's going to open this second day of our conference on big data and competition and platforms. And she's going to speak about access barriers to big data. So, Professor Gal, all yours.
You want to open it? Should I? Is this the... Yes. Okay, fine. So hopefully the clicker will work from here, because otherwise you have to have divided attention between the screen and me. So I'm very happy to be here. Thank you so much. Thank you, Carmen, for inviting me. This is a pleasure. First time in Valencia. Wonderful. From what I saw yesterday, just an hour walking around the city, because unfortunately I got here late. The subject that the paper that actually Carmen chose, I sent her several. The paper that Carmen chose that I will present today is a paper that I wrote with Dan Rubenfeld a few years ago. We actually started working on it about 4 years ago, and was published about 2 years ago. But since then, looking at it, I was sitting and reading the paper and reading and preparing. And I said, there's so much that has changed since I wrote it and since it was published even 2 years ago. So what I want to give you is the flavor of the arguments, but also make it relevant. Also tie it to some of the issues we have today, 2018, and looking forward to what we know and what we don't know. Because I think that big data is a buzzword that everybody uses, and everybody would agree. I mean, it's old news that big data is important, right, for our economy. Big data was declared. Sorry, let me try. Okay, it does work. Big data was declared to be a significant economic asset, which fuels our information economy, and data was always valuable. It's not that data became valuable only a few years ago. It was definitely part of many of the systems we had before: governmental system, economic system, social systems. Information was always valuable. What changed was the volume. That's why it's called big data. And when you look for a definition of what big data is, one of the definitions, the most common definitions, is this is the amount of data which you could not process on a regular computer. Okay? So it's so much data that you need actually a more sophisticated system. Now, as you can see, this by itself is a moving target because computers are becoming stronger and stronger. Our personal computers are becoming stronger and stronger. And as they are becoming stronger, they can process more and more data. Okay? And the volume of data is also increasing exponentially. And data is extremely important for many fields in life. It is actually a game changer in many fields because it allows us to engage in more sophisticated decision making, fact-based decisional making. And this is in many spheres. Of course, the commercial sphere, which products are better for which consumers, or for firms, what is the highest price that the consumer is willing to pay for a certain good? Okay, what are the trends in the market? How much should a producer produce in a certain year, for example? But it's not only for government, for commercial firms. It's also important in other fields in life. Think about government. Government is using a lot of big data and has used a lot of data for many purposes. Part of it today is to find out about disease outbreaks. There are algorithms who actually try to show where a disease is going to spread, or climate changes, or corruption, or terror, right? I mean, you use data analytics in order to show trends that might be happening in certain places. And I think this is really an interesting one. We can talk about it more later, but there's a field, a growing field, that a lot of people are now starting to write about. It's called personalized law. I don't know if you've heard about it or not, but it's a growing trend. And the idea is that data can be valuable. You can use the data about each and every person, not only to create personalized products and services, but also to create personalized laws. What does that mean? It means that if the government knows that I am this risk-lover driver, that my eyesight is bad, that I take risks on the street and whatever, and it knows that Maggie, for example, is a very careful driver, and she's always cautious, whatever. So on the same street, for example, she would be able to drive 60 kilometers per hour, and I will be able to drive 40. Okay? And this is just one example of where this literature is going with. So the idea, again, is to use the data in order to create personalized laws, not only products, personalized laws. We can debate. I have another paper on that. We can debate it later over coffee, if you want. So it's important for the commercial sphere. It's important for the government. It's important for our relations. It's important for politicians. Think about what happened with Cambridge Analytica, right? Cambridge Analytica was an attempt. You can argue about whether it was successful or not. It was an attempt to use big data in order to affect politics, right? Political views. So, and it's of course very useful to individuals as well. In good ways and in bad ways, we can get better products. If you think about it, one of the great examples of how big data can help us is through what is called personalized medicine. Because medicine today is based on averages. Most people will be affected by this and that drug, this way and that way. However, we're all different. We all have different systems, and the small differences can make a big differences for us. We all know that some drugs work on our friends, and I mean drugs in the good. I should say pharmaceuticals, right? Some pharmaceuticals work better on us than our friends, right? Why? Because these are personalized traits, bodily traits. Okay, so if we can use the big data in order to create better products. For example, there is this incredible new product called Day 2, where you send them a sample of, I don't want to say what, it comes out of your stomach, and then they tell you how your body reacts, sugar levels, to everything you eat. And it's you, not the person near you. And this is based on big data analytics. So big data is very good. Okay, of course, it has some bad sides to it. We just heard just a few days ago about how bosses and abusive spouses are using big data and the ability to track people and know more about them in ways which might be harmful. Okay, so for some years, there has been, with regard to big data, a lot of what I call, and I should say, if I haven't said, this is a paper with Dan Rubenfeld. He's a professor both at Berkeley and NYU. He's an economist. He used to be the chief economist of the DOJ. He's the one who brought the Microsoft case in the US, for example. So this is a joint paper, okay? So for many years, there has been what we call lazy talk about big data, okay? There were people on both sides that talked about big data without really grounding it. So on the one side, there were scholars like Danny Sokol, who said, ooh, big data, no entry barriers at all. Everybody can collect it from everywhere, and it's non-rivalrous, so once everybody has, once one has big data, the other ones can collect it, no problem at all. So the idea was, you don't have to regulate anything that has to do with big data because everybody can collect it, okay, easily collect it. On the other side, there are people who said, okay, so there are some markets in which big data is not so easily collected. It might be easily collected in some markets, but not in all. However, they did not specify in which markets and what are the entry barriers. This was what we called lazy talk. So what Dan and I tried to do in this paper is we actually went and talked with people who have firms who use big data. And I'm very fortunate because I live in Israel, there are a lot of startups. So I actually went and talked to people who have startup based on big data. And I asked, okay, what is your comparative advantage? What do you have that somebody else does not have? What is an easy input? What is a difficult input? Okay? What are the barriers to getting data in different markets? This is where this paper comes from. Okay? And I think that the thinking behind it, that you actually have to analyze the specifics of the data market and not make these broad claims, is important even today. Because if you think about mergers of firms with data, joint ventures of firms with data, you want to find out if a firm with data has market power. All these issues are important. And you actually cannot talk about big data in a general manner. You can say general things, but if you should look at the access barriers on all the data chain and all parts of the data chain, because they're all important, okay? And you should look at the specific types of data that you that are relevant to whatever you're checking, because it might be that a certain firm would have market power over certain type of data which is really important for that industry. Nobody in the world has a monopoly over all the data. Okay, there's not one market for big data. Okay, it might be that some firms have much more data than others. Now, does that mean anything? Definitely it does. Why? Because sometimes having a lot of data, even from very different sources, allows you to find correlations that you will never think about. Okay, so some of the correlations that are surprising, but then you learn more about your environment, and then you need a lot of data. So a computer scientist would say more data is good. Okay, Why? Because it enables you to do more correlations. Let me give you just one example of a correlation that was found that was surprising. Okay, that people who engage in fraud, online fraud, have a tendency to use more block letters than others. Okay, but it's a correlation. It was found, and that means that an algorithm can find people who use more block letters, if you know that, right? And that narrows down, in a sense, some of what you're looking for, because we think that the analysis is easy, but the analysis is very costly. It takes analyzing a lot of data, really big data. It's costly in terms of energy, okay? There's a high cost of energy here, and time. Because even our fastest computers take time to process that huge amounts of data. Okay, so again, when we talk about big data, we have to be more specific about what we're talking about. Okay, so all these issues I think are really important because, I'm using the wrong clicker. Yeah, because as The Economist said, 2 years ago, in a very interesting volume that it had on big data, it said, this is an information war. Because information is so important that everybody wants to get information. And so the ones that have information, or the relevant information, are going to have a comparative advantage. Okay, so let's talk a bit about big data, okay, and talk a bit about what big data, what it actually means. So, as I said, big data is a generic name, okay, for data, for a lot of data, and I just defined it a few minutes ago. It is usually characterized by the 4 V's, and it's really nice that they found nice names for all these, starting with V's. So first of all, trivial is volume. Okay, we talked about the large volume, but there are 3 more dimensions which are important. Velocity. Velocity is the freshness of the data. When was the data collected? What is the speed of change in your database? Now, some past data might be very valuable, but some might not be relevant anymore. If you're looking about trends in toys, okay, the trends in toys about what people buy for Christmas for their children, last year's information is no longer relevant. You want to be the producer that knows what are going to be the trends for this year in order to prepare for that. Okay? So velocity is important in some industries more than others. In some industries, past data is going to be extremely important. So again, depending on the industry, like I said in the beginning. Variety. Very important. We can relate this to economies of scale. Contrast with economies of scope, right? So variety is characterized by the number of different types of data that are in the database, which might, and then, as I told you, if you have very different types of data, you can then find correlations that you haven't thought about before in your data. Veracity relates to the truthfulness of the data or its accuracy. How much can you rely on the data? When you ask people how much money they make, they usually have a tendency to say something which is, maybe in the vicinity of what they make, but not exactly truthful. If you ask some people how old they are, again, you have some things that are not necessarily truthful. Sometimes we give an answer which we think is truthful, but we're not aware of ourselves. If we're asked about our traits, do we actually know ourselves really well? Would a digital profile of us not be sometimes better or more accurate of who we really are, how risk averse we are, for example? Okay, so this is the truthfulness of the data. Some data is more truthful, some isn't. Okay, some is more accurate just because you know where the data came from, you know who collected it, you know that the speeding camera had, for example, a rate of of being correct of whatever, it might be high or low. So these 4 characteristics relate to the collection of data. But what gives big data its advantage, bless you, is of course its analysis. And one thing that, which is important here is of course data science. Data science uses a lot of tools, some of which have also become buzz names, like deep learning or artificial intelligence. But if you ask the computer scientists, they will tell you that many of these tools have been around for at least 20, 30 years. So the algorithms are not the big change. The ideas were there. However, the computer scientists did not have the data to test them on. Now they do. So what has changed is the algorithms together with the data. Okay? Now, as I said before, if you want to analyze any market power in data markets, you really need to ask yourself not only about the collection. So many people talk about the collection all the time. But the collection is only part of the data value chain. So the data value chain is, of course, the collection. Okay, you start by the collection. And by the way, you have to decide what to collect, because there's so many features of the data, and you don't have storage space for all of it. So one thing to decide is, what exactly do I want to measure? Do I want to measure color? Do I want to measure depth? Do I want to measure air temperature? Do I want to measure? There are so many features that, first of all, you have to decide about the collection. Then you have the analysis of the data, okay? But it's not only the analysis, it's also the organization. How do you organize the data in the database? And then you analyze it, and then you store it. And you might even store it before the analysis, okay? And then you use it, okay? So there's a data value chain that you have to look at all the parts before. So what are the entry barriers to these parts of the data value chain? I'll go quickly through them because I want to get to some of the implications of these issues. So with regard to collection, we can think about different entry barriers. For example, there might be data that is unique. Okay, for example, Facebook. A few years ago, there was a large outcry about Facebook collecting data about all kinds of interactions. They wanted to see how we react, how our moods change when they show us different types of information, and how that affects our buying moods, whether we would buy more or less, once our moods are set in a certain way. So these are unique interactions that Facebook can create, maybe Amazon can create, but other firms cannot create them. These are unique access points to the data. Economies of scale, scope, speed. I think we all in the room will know what we're talking about. More data or more unique data, or data that is more fresh, right? Might give you a comparative advantage. Two-level entry. What happens when the data is a product, a byproduct of another activity you are engaged in? For example, one of the firms we talked with said that it is organizing in a database data for another firm which engages in fracking. This is a way of searching or for oil. Okay, so they're doing the fracking anyway, but then they have information about the geo conditions in that area. So are you going to engage in fracking in order to just get the data about the geological conditions? No, you're not. Okay, so this might create a barrier to collection. I'm going to jump over some of them. Data protection and privacy laws, of course. Think about the GDPR. The GDPR, for example, and we can talk about whether it's doing good or bad. It's doing a lot of good. But again, I'm not sure that all of its parts are rightly structured. But again, these are laws that prevent some collection of information. You don't need the information for the service. You cannot collect it, okay? These are legal barriers. Data ownership issues with regard to who owns the database. You would not believe how important it is with regard to how you organize the data. If you've organized the data in a certain way, even if the data belongs to you, the organization in the database might be protected. And this is a barrier. This might be a barrier in many places. Okay, I'm going to jump over some of these. Storage. So storage is a wonderful example where technology has reduced entry barriers. Just up until, 10 years or so, you had to store the data in your own facilities. So that created a lot of problems because not all the firms who use data had the ability to store. Today, this is an incredible invention, right? This is like, if you want, this is an international sharing platform. Inge, this is for you. So the cloud has created the ability to store it anywhere in the world, creating more efficient systems. However, there is still switching costs. My brother works in Amazon, and they are now getting into databases, okay? And he says that one of the problems is that once they try to get into another, they try to offer their services, people say, well, we've organized it in a certain way, okay? And now just transferring the data and putting it in the way that you want us to organize it is going to be very costly for us. Okay. And Schrems is, of course, an example of legal barriers to storage, where you can store internationally. Synthesis and analysis, again, it depends on data compatibility. Does data talk with each other? I mean, can you actually, does the data interoperate? Because it might be that you have one type of data which does not, is very difficult to then put together with another type of data. Let me just give you one example. Let's assume that you have data about buses, and one database checked every 5 minutes, and another one checked every 3 minutes. Okay, even that makes it a bit difficult to put the data together. Usage, again, there might be very high barriers to usage. Some of them might be legal, some of them might be behavioral, some of them might be technological. I mean, what are you allowed to do with the data once you have it? Or even if you can do something, can you then do you have access to the people that you can assist with that data? So these are issues which are important. Okay, so just a few general issues with regard to entry barriers, because what I did up until now is try to identify entry barriers along the data value chain. So just a bit about some lessons. Okay, there might be potential entry barriers in all parts of the data value chain. You have to look at all the parts in order for the analysis to work. And the strengths might differ among markets. Some markets, it might be really easy to collect the data which is relevant. Some markets, you don't actually need too much data. In other markets, you need unique data. And there might be very high barriers to its collection, to its analysis, to its storage, whatever. These entry barriers might sometimes be cumulative or might sometimes cancel each other out, because it might be that you don't have a lot of data. However, you have, for example, much fresher data than your competitors. So that sometimes might be enough for you to create a comparative advantage. So again, you have to think about how these entry barriers interact with each other. And of course, you have to take into account that everybody that has data, or almost everybody in the commercial sphere, would have incentives to create or erect entry barriers. So this is something we have to think about, and when we analyze markets. What are the effects on competition? Some effects on competition. First of all, I think it's important to understand that data is multidimensional. You don't have to only analyze how much data, but it's important to analyze other dimensions, the three other V's as well, in order to get a correct analysis. That is a public good. I think this is really a fun thing to think about, for us academics. Because data, once collected and once is out there, can actually, if it is observable, it doesn't need to be only observable directly. It can be observable indirectly in order to affect competition. And let me give you an example. There was a firm that, using geological insurance company, that by using a lot of data about the geological conditions, knew where there were higher chances of, how do you call it when there's a lot of water? Flooding, okay? So what it did is in areas where there were low chances of flooding, it then offered lower insurance rates. Now, if you're a competitor and you know exactly what it's doing, you don't necessarily need the data, right? All you have to do is say, that firm is offering a lower rate, I will match it because I know it's based on data. Okay, so you can think about these with regard to how you can overcome comparative advantages with regard to data. Data is a byproduct, for example. Again, if this is a two-sided or two-level entry, you have to ask yourself, are there entry barriers at any level? Okay, not only the level of the data, but the level where it was collected, okay, in order to have a correct analysis of the market. Multivariate analysis here, is that, of course, we all know that, but I think we all have to remind ourselves of this all the time. Data analysis is not only about competition law. Data analysis is, based on consumer protection, data protection, IP laws sometimes, privacy, okay, and something which is missing from a lot of these analyses, but we have to put on the table, cybersecurity. Cybersecurity threats are becoming so important in recent years that we have to take that into analysis once we talk about databases as well. Okay. So what this means, how much time? I am almost out of time. Sorry?
We are running out of time.
We're running out of time. Okay. So just, there are, what happens is that, at least with regard to some types of data, not all types, but some types of data, especially when the volume and the variety are important. We have data oligopolies, okay? We have markets with a few large firms with extremely big databases. These might be important for some markets. For example, search markets, okay? When Google has an advantage in. But even then, and then we have to ask ourselves whether our tools are ready for, how's this going? I wanted to go, then we have to ask ourselves, go forward, please. And one more. Okay, and no, just skip this one, skip. Okay. And, next slide. Okay, yes. This is my last slide that I want to talk about. Okay, so just a few things that Dan and I said about legal misfit And there's more to be said, and there's some people in the room like Marco and Maggie and Giuseppe who've already said some interesting things about them. But just to put this, for us, there's a legal misfit with regard to at least some of the issues that we have here. We have some of their laws are privacy-centered laws, which serve other goals, do not necessarily cater to competition concerns. We have to think about the incentives here. The gateway to many of our laws is significant market powers, but what happens if we have oligopolies? Right? We don't have such good tools to deal with them. Market definition, we can talk about why market definition might be problematic in such a setting, at least what we're doing right now. Studies about economies and network effects are extremely important, and these are things that we have to take into account with regard to our analysis. How large are them? Defining abuse. What exactly does abuse mean in these settings? And remedies, a study by Marco and some of his colleagues has done that in recent years. So, can you? Sorry. So, okay. So I'll finish here. Okay. So we have a bit of time for discussion. And okay, can you go? Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much, Professor Gal. We will have 10 short minutes in order to do Q&A and to discuss some of the really interesting things that Professor Gal has showed us. So, any questions?
Yes.
Carmen,
thank you for the speech. It was highly interesting, and I have two questions actually. They are connected. In the markets that you mentioned, the gathering, the storage, the analysis, and the uses of data, I wanted to ask you, in which of them do you think the entry barriers are higher, and where, in these cases, where dominant positions are generating, and whether you think that the essential facilities doctrine will have an important role to solve the problems that may arise in these situations.
Okay. Thank you for these important questions. With regard to which barrier is higher, I think it depends on the market. I think you cannot give a general answer. The highest barriers often are the legal ones. The legal ones are ones you cannot play around, usually. So, for example, if you have a prevention of use of data in a certain way, that might prevent, that might create a high entry barrier in some markets. Or if you have Schrems, okay, it says you can only store the data in a certain place, not in another place. Okay, this is a legal barrier that is very hard to overcome by technological means. So it really depends on the type of data that you're talking about, and whether whether the barrier is a behavioral one, a legal one, a technological one, because technological barriers sometimes can be overcome. And one, I think, wonderful example here is the example of storage of the cloud. However, some technological barriers might take years to overcome. So it really depends. Okay, behavioral barriers. Think about usage. Right now, just in the past few months, there has been a huge outcry with regard to Facebook and Cambridge Analytica. Some people said this is a Rubicon. After that, people are not going to give their data so freely. But look at us. If you look at the statistics, 25, and I think this is really a fun fact for academics, to just think about. 25% of the people who have said that Facebook should be punished by us leaving them did that through Facebook, Instagram, Okay, these are WhatsApp, which are firms which are all held together. Okay, how many people have left Facebook? Almost none. Okay, so what does that say? Is that the Rubicon for us? No. So behavioral limitations might sometimes seem to be very important, but we do not seem to act upon them. So much depends on how high the barrier is, depends on how serious we think this is and how we actually react, not what we say, but actually how we react in practice. Okay? With regard to the essential facilities doctrine, I definitely think it might be important. However, again, it depends on the market. In some markets, the information might be essential and there might not be ways around it. Assume that you have a flood and one firm has taken aerial maps of how the area looked before the flood. So you actually know what damage was done and to which houses. Okay? It's the only firm that has this data. Is this an essential input in the insurance market? Definitely, it might be. Nobody else has it, right? But is all data essential? No. So you have to be very specific in the market that you're looking for.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I had a question about the market definition on the data market.
Yes.
So, correct me if I'm wrong before the question, but my understanding is that you would disagree that the data market is one market. But my understanding is that you believe that each industry, or depending on the goal of it, we should define the market differently. If this is the case, and I agree with you, how can we define a market in an evolving technology? So the data that can have a goal today might have 5 more goals in 2 years, or X data can have a goal and Y data cannot have a goal, but if you have Y plus Z data, you might have X goal as well. I don't know if that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense.
So how do you proceed to define? Is there any point at even having market definition now, or how can you define market definition in that word?
Right. It's, again, an excellent question, and thank you for that. And first of all, of course, I agree that there's no such thing as a data market. You cannot define a data market. It doesn't exist. Data, it has to be a certain data for a certain use, because data is an input. It's not, I mean, you don't want to have data sitting there just for, just to have data. You want to use data as an input for analysis. It's just like you don't want piles of gold if you have nobody to then exchange it with, right? Data is the same. It's an input in certain markets. So there's no market just for data. There's markets for certain types of data. Some of them might have many features. Some of them might have only one feature, like the example that I gave you before. Okay? So it really depends on the use. Now, is there any, should we even try to define data markets if they change? First of all, I think that at least in some markets, we know what the input is right now. Okay? We know what's out there. We know the input. So it's relatively easy. Okay? In other markets, it might be more difficult, and these are the markets where you do not know what you're looking for. Okay? Then it becomes really difficult. But then you can use economists together with data scientists in order to ask what are the correlations or what are the combinations of data that you think might be more helpful in a certain market. And again, I think that here, as lawyers or legal scholars, we cannot do this alone. We have to work in teams. We have to work in teams together with economists and together with technology people, with data scientists, in order to know what technology offers and in order to know what is needed. Now, one of the problems is that most of the economic studies with regard to data, anybody who's tried to look at this, I think will share my frustration that there are no good studies about the economies of scale and scope which are needed for data. And one of the reasons, and there are just a few, and the ones that are there have been funded by Google. So do we really want to put all our money on them? No. Okay? I mean, what we need are more economists that will go into these issues, that will study how data is important in certain markets, and give us some more indications of how much data is needed in certain markets.
On that, if I can, just a follow-up question on that. And then again, I agree completely. It's really good analysis, but often machine learning finds correlations we don't understand.
Right.
And even technologists, even the programmers of the machine, of the algorithm, the initial algorithm,
Sure.
don't understand the correlations.
Right.
And the AlphaGo example is like, so
I agree.
how, even if we employ more people, tech people, even if we employ an army of them, one algorithm, one AI could be sufficient to find correlations we have no clue about, and we don't even know the machine knows. So how do we combat this side of it?
Right.
When,
Right. So the question is, and it's a very good question, how do we know what we don't know? Right?
Yeah.
Is this a good framing? Okay. And it's a question that we have with regard to any technology, by the way, not only with regard to big data. I think that we should stick to what we are relatively certain about. And there are also some certainty about uncertainty. Okay? So we can actually use that as well, but we need studies. We need better studies.
So, if there's one more question, because we have already
There's
Professor
one.
Michal Felling connecting with
Oh.
us. Marco.
So, thank you, Michal, for the interesting presentation. My question is about cybersecurity.
Yes.
So, as you know, in the GDPR, cybersecurity is mentioned now. So, the owners of the data set, we are talking about personal data, is the duty to ensure the cybersecurity. You mentioned about the threats of cybersecurity. I think cybersecurity is also expensive as such. Do you see cybersecurity as a sort of entry barrier in this market, or how do you, let's say, perceive it?
Well, much depends on how the law would be applied, because cybersecurity is costly. Cybersecurity means that you have to encrypt what you're doing, and you have to encrypt it in a way which is reasonable. Okay, so you won't then be sued. Okay, finding that you have not fulfilled the expectations of your consumers or the expectation with regard based on the GDPR. Okay, so cybersecurity is definitely a barrier. Definitely. How high it depends on how good the off-the-shelf solutions are going to be. And I think that from what I see, governments are beginning to understand that this is an issue that you cannot leave in the hands of private firms. Many of them simply do not know, what the risks are. And some of them have no incentive, not strong incentives, to overcome these risks or find solutions. So if the government finds a solution, that of course would reduce the entry barrier for all. But we're only in the beginning of this. There are private firms who are doing this right now. It's highly costly. And this is, again, we're talking about an information war. This is a cyber war, where you try to create a kind of encryption, and there are firms coming in and trying to break that encryption. Then you try to create another kind of encryption. This is very, very, very costly.
So thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Gal. I think it has been really interesting. I'm an administrative law professor, so I have my bias. And all the things that you have discussed, mostly from a private law perspective, for me are really interesting, because I am always thinking about how could we do something from the public power to try to make this realm, this field in which different companies are competing flatter and equal and more equal. So and I think there's a lot of things that we could also discuss on that, and that's why we have organized this conference also with administrative law professors. And we have Michal Felling, so thank you very much.